The afternoon sun was beating down hard on the asphalt of the quiet suburban street. It was the kind of Tuesday that feels like every other Tuesday lays, slow and uneventful. People were at work, kids were in school, and the only sounds came from the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant lawnmower. Into this calmness, a dark sedan rolled slowly. It was a nice car, polished and expensive, moving with the kind of ease that makes it look like it's floating. Inside, a man sat behind the wheel. He was wearing a crisp suit that looked like it cost more than most people make in a month. He was tired. His eyes were a little heavy, and his mind was still spinning from the files he had been staring at all morning. He just wanted to get to his destination, grab a coffee and breathe for a minute. Up ahead, a police cruiser was parked under the shade of a large oak tree. 2 officers sat inside. They were watching the road, bored, looking for anything that might break the monotony of their shift. When the dark sedan approached the stop sign at the corner, the man inside didn't come to a complete halt for a 3-second stop. He rolled through it slowly. It was the kind of mistake almost every driver makes at some point, especially on an empty street. But to the bored officers, it was an opening. A flash of brake lights, a momentary pause, and then the car kept moving. That was all it took. The cruiser's engine roared to life. Within seconds, blue and red lights were flashing in the man's rearview mirror. A heavy sigh escaped his lips. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't run a red light. He checked his mirrors, signaled, and pulled over to the side of the road, putting the car in park. He didn't reach for his glove box. He didn't start digging through his pockets. He simply placed his hands on the top of the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 positions. He knew the drill. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know exactly how nervous officers can get during a traffic stop. And he knew that being a black man in a nice car often added a layer of tension that he couldn't control. He just wanted this to be over quickly. In the cruiser, the 2 officers were communicating over their radios. "Running the plate," one said. The other adjusted his mirror and stared at the back of the sedan. "Nice ride," he muttered. "Probably a rental or something stolen. Let's stay sharp." They stepped out of the car. The first officer, a tall man with a stern face, walked toward the driver's side. The second officer hung back, approaching the passenger side, but staying slightly behind the rear bumper, his hand resting near his belt. This is standard procedure for a risky stop, but the energy felt different. It felt aggressive. The man in the sedan watched them in the side mirror. He kept his face neutral, calm, but his muscles began to tighten. He could see the way the first officer was walking not casually, but with a rigid purpose, like he was approaching a threat, not a citizen who had made a minor traffic error. The window of the sedan was down. The officer didn't smile. He didn't say good afternoon, or do you know why I pulled you over? He stopped a few feet from the door, his boots crunching on the gravel. His hand was hovering right next to his holster. "License and registration," the officer barked. It was a command, not a request. "Good afternoon, officer," the man said softly. His voice was deep and steady. He didn't move his hands. "Is there a problem?" "I ask for your license and registration," the officer repeated, louder this time. Now, the man nodded slowly. "It's in my pocket," he said, "and my registration is in the glove box. I'm going to reach for them, okay?" "Don't reach," the officer snapped, taking a half-step closer, his eyes darting around the inside of the car. "Keep your hands on the wheel." The man on the passenger side was now peering into the car through the glass, scanning the back seat, looking under the seats. The air was thick and heavy. The man in the suit felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. It was a feeling of disbelief mixed with frustration. He had spent his adult life serving his country, working in high-pressure situations where every second counted, where lives were on the line. He was a highly trained federal agent. He carried a badge that gave him authority across the entire nation. Yet right now, in his own neighborhood, he was being treated like a suspect, "Sir," the man said, trying to keep his voice level. "I am not a threat. I am complying. I just need to tell you that I am armed." The reaction was immediate and explosive. The moment the word armed left his lips, the dynamic shifted instantly. The officer on the driver's side took a large step back, drawing his weapon partially from its holster, shouting, "Gun." "He's got a gun." "No," I said. "I am. Get your hands up." "Get them up now." The officer screamed, his face turning red. "Hands out the window." The second officer yelled from the passenger side, pulling his own weapon and pointing it at the man's head. The man froze. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't lower them. He just kept them gripping the steering wheel, knowing that any sudden movement could be his last. He looked the officer in the eye. He wasn't afraid of dying. Exactly, he had faced danger before, but he was terrified of dying here. On the side of this road, over a misunderstanding, he was terrified of what would happen to his family if he became another headline. "I am a federal agent," he said clearly, enunciating every word. "My badge is on my belt. My firearm is holstered. I am telling you this for your safety and mine. Shut up." The officer yelled. He pulled his service weapon fully out now, aiming it directly at the man's chest. "Open the door with your left hand." "Do it slowly." The man hesitated. Opening the door meant taking a hand off the wheel. It meant moving. In this heightened state of panic, movement could be interpreted as aggression. But he also knew that staying put wasn't working. The officers were too far gone, too pumped up on adrenaline and suspicion to listen to reason. They saw a black man in a suit who had admitted to having a gun. They weren't seeing the person. They were seeing a threat. Slowly, painfully slowly, the man moved his left hand from the wheel. He pushed the door open. The heat from the outside rushed in. Before he could even place his foot on the pavement, the officer grabbed the door, yanked it open the rest of the way, and lunged inside. "Get out. Get out of the car." The officer grabbed the man by the collar of his expensive jacket and pulled hard. The man stumbled, trying to keep his balance, but the force was too much. He spilled out of the car and onto the rough pavement. The impact knocked the wind out of him. Before he could even try to catch his breath, he felt a heavy knee press into the middle of his back, driving him into the ground. "Stop resisting." The officer shouted, even though the man wasn't moving. He was just lying there, accepting the weight, trying to stay alive. "I'm not resisting," the man gasped, his face pressed against the grit of the road. "Please, just look at my belt." He felt cold metal snap around his wrists. The plastic zip ties were tight, cutting into his skin. The second officer was there now, his foot on the man's leg, pinning him down. They were shouting commands at each other, checking for weapons, scanning the area for backup that wasn't there. It was chaotic and loud. The man lay still, his eyes closed for a moment, blocking out the humiliation. He imagined the neighbors peeking through their blinds, seeing the man who lived down the street face down in the dirt with police kneeling on him. He wondered what they would think. He wondered if it would even matter if he told them the truth. The first officer reached around the man's waist and grabbed the holstered gun. He unclipped it and pulled it free. Then, his fingers brushed against the metal badge clipped to the belt. He paused for a fraction of a second. The shouting stopped. The man waited, his heart pounding in his ears, hoping that the piece of metal would finally make them see him as a human being. But the officer didn't let go. He didn't uncuff him. He just tossed the badge onto the seat of the car and grabbed the man's arm, hauling him up roughly to sit on the curb. "Nice prop," the officer sneered, holding up the badge. "You think carrying a fake badge gives you the right to carry a gun?" The man looked up, blood trickling from a small scrape on his forehead. He looked at the officer, then at the cruiser, then at the gun now sitting on the hood of the police car. He realized then that this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't just a bad traffic stop. It was something much deeper and much harder to fix. He took a deep breath, letting the dust settle in his lungs. He knew this wasn't going to end with a simple apology. It was going to be a long, hard fight to prove who he really was. The heat radiating off the pavement was intense, burning through the fabric of the man's suit pants as he sat on the curb. It was a sharp, stinging contrast to the cold sweat running down his spine. His wrists were bound tightly behind his back, the plastic ties digging deeper into his skin with every subtle movement he made. A few feet away, the taller officer stood, with his back turned, casually inspecting the badge and credentials he had tossed onto the hood of the patrol car. He handled the federal ID like it was a toy found in a cereal box, flipping it over with a dismissive flick of his wrist. The second officer, the one who had stayed closer, loomed over the man. He had his hand resting on his belt, right next to the pepper spray and the baton, watching every twitch of the detainee's muscles like a hawk watching a field mouse. The silence between them was heavy, filled only by the hum of the police cruiser's engine and the distant sound of a dog barking. It was the kind of silence that feels loud, screaming of tension and things left unsaid. "You want to tell me where you really got that toy?" The officer standing over him asked. His voice wasn't shouting anymore. It was low, dripping with a kind of arrogant curiosity. "Because last time I checked, they don't hand those out at the corner store." The man on the curb didn't look down. He looked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle of the street. He knew that looking down could be seen as submission or guilt, and looking up could be seen as aggression. He had to find the perfect balance. He took a slow, controlled breath, trying to force his heart rate down from the sprint it was currently doing. "That is a bureau-issued credential," the man said, his voice steady despite the burning in his shoulders. "The serial number on the back matches the file in Washington. If you run it, you will confirm who I am." The officer scoffed, a short, dry sound that was more annoying than threatening. He took a step closer, invading the man's personal space, trying to get a reaction. "We ran your plates. They come back clean, but that doesn't mean anything. Stolen cars can have clean plates if the thieves are good enough. And you? You fit the profile of a guy who thinks he's smarter than the cops." "I am not trying to be smarter than anyone," the man replied softly. "I am trying to help you avoid making a mistake that will end both of our careers. You have a federal agent in custody. You have confiscated a service weapon. Every second you keep me here like this is a second that puts you further into legal jeopardy." The officer's face hardened. He didn't like being told what to do, especially not by someone sitting on the curb in handcuffs. He leaned down, getting right into the man's face. "You think you're scary because you have a fake badge? You think because you're wearing a fancy suit, I'm supposed to be impressed? It's not about being scary or impressive," the man said. He turned his head slightly, finally making eye contact. "It is about the law. And right now, you are breaking it." The officer stood up abruptly, clearly irritated by the man's calmness. He hated that he couldn't get a rise out of him. He wanted fear. He wanted panic. He wanted this guy to start begging or crying so he could feel like the one in total control. But this man wasn't giving him that satisfaction. He was sitting with the dignity of a king, even with his hands tied behind his back. "Check the car again," the officer barked at his partner, who was still fiddling with the badge by the cruiser. "Search the glove box, the trunk, everything. I bet this guy has a stack of fake IDs in there." The other officer nodded and walked back toward the sedan. He opened the driver's side door and started rummaging through the interior. He pulled out the registration and insurance card, scrutinizing them like they were ancient artifacts. Then he reached for the glove box. The man on the curb shifted his weight. "There is nothing illegal in the vehicle," he said, "but there is sensitive bureau paperwork. I would advise you not to touch files that are above your clearance level." The taller officer laughed loudly, throwing his head back. "Did you hear that? Above my clearance level, this guy watches too many movies." While the officers were distracted by their own jokes in the search, the man scanned the street. He knew that in a few minutes the GPS tracker in his car would ping an anomaly to his field office. The system was designed to detect if a car was stationary for too long in an unauthorized zone, or if the emergency signal was triggered. He hadn't triggered the silent alarm yet, the panic button under the dash, because he didn't want a SWAT team rolling up on two local beat cops who were just doing their job poorly. He wanted to give them a chance to fix this. He wanted to believe that this was just a misunderstanding that could be solved with a phone call. But as he watched the tall officer pull a stack of papers from his glove box and wave them in the air, mocking him, that hope was starting to fade. The officer wasn't checking the names. He wasn't reading the headers. He was just treating them as evidence of some unnamed crime. "Look at this," the tall officer said, marching over. "Official-looking paperwork. You've got a whole office in here, don't you? Who are you working for? You running drugs?" Hitting banks? I work for the government, the man said, his voice losing just a fraction of its patience. I am telling you, call the number on the credentials. It takes 2 minutes. I'm not calling your girlfriend, the officer sneered. I'm calling dispatch to get a tow truck for this vehicle. We're impounding it until we figure out who you really are. That was the tipping point. If they impounded the car, the sensitive equipment inside would be compromised. Cases could be blown. Informants' lives could be put at risk. The man couldn't let that happen. He realized that playing nice wasn't working. These officers weren't interested in the truth. They were interested in being right. You cannot impound this vehicle, the man said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming hard as steel. I am placing you under notice. If you tow that car, you are interfering with a federal investigation. The officer froze for a second, surprised by the change in tone. Then, his face flushed red with anger. He didn't like being challenged. He walked over and grabbed the man by the arm, yanking him up from the curb. The man stumbled, his balance thrown off by his hands still being tied behind his back. Who do you think you are? The officer shouted, getting nose-to-nose with him. You don't give orders here. I give the orders. The man straightened his back as much as he could. He didn't look away. He stared into the officer's eyes, projecting a calmness that he didn't entirely feel. I am a federal agent, he said slowly and clearly. And you are assaulting a federal officer? You have exactly 30 seconds to release me and return my weapon before this becomes a matter for the Department of Justice. The officer hesitated. There was something in the man's eyes, a cold, professional confidence, that made him pause. It wasn't the look of a con artist who had been caught. It was the look of a man who had stared into the abyss before and didn't blink. But the officer's pride was a heavy thing. It wouldn't let him back down now, not in front of his partner, and not in front of this suspect. He shoved the man back down onto the curb. Sit down and shut up, he spat. You're not a Fed. You're just another thug with a story. The man sat there, the dust coating his expensive suit. He looked at the traffic slowly passing by on the main road a block away. Nobody knew what was happening here. Nobody knew that a highly trained agent was being humiliated on the side of the road by 2 cops who couldn't read a badge. He realized then that the waiting game was over. He couldn't rely on their competence. He had to escalate. He shifted his weight, pressing his side against the curb. Hidden under the lining of his suit jacket, pressed against his hip, was a small, hard emergency button. He had never used it in the field. It was a last resort. But as he watched, the second officer ripping through his personal files in the car, laughing, he knew that last resort had arrived. He pressed his hip against the concrete, grinding the button hard, silently miles away. A computer terminal in a windowless room flashed red. A dispatcher's phone began to ring. On the curb, the man took a deep breath. The game had changed. Now, it was just a matter of time. He looked up at the tall officer who was wiping sweat from his forehead, looking annoyed. I hope you have a good lawyer, the man said quietly. Why? You gonna sue me? The officer mocked. No, the man replied, a grim look settling over his face. I'm not going to sue you. But the United States government is about to ask you some very difficult questions. The officer laughed, shaking his head. He turned his back again, confident that he was in control of the situation. But the man sitting on the curb knew the truth. The clock was ticking, and the cavalry was already on the way. The seconds dragged by, feeling thick and heavy like syrup dripping from a spoon. The man sat on the curb, the rough concrete scratching against the back of his legs. His shoulders were screaming in pain, his muscles cramping up because his hands were still zip-tied behind his back. He tried to shift his weight to find a position that didn't hurt, but there wasn't one. He just had to endure it. He watched the taller officer pacing back and forth near the patrol car. The officer had calmed down a little, but now he was just annoyed. He kept looking at his watch, then looking at the man, then looking down the empty road. It was clear that he didn't know what to do next. He had pulled a guy over, found a gun and a badge, and now he was stuck in a weird gray area. He had committed to the idea that this was a fake, but deep down, the silence was probably starting to bother him. The silence is where the doubt lives. the officer said, breaking the quiet. If you just admit where you bought the fake ID, we might go easier on you. Impersonating a federal officer is a felony. You're looking at serious time. The man on the curb looked down at the asphalt. He saw an aunt carrying a crumb, marching along determinedly, oblivious to the giant humans arguing nearby. He focused on that aunt. It grounded him. It reminded him that there was a world outside of this nightmare. I didn't buy it, the man said softly. I earned it. Yeah. The officer waved his hand dismissively. Save it for the judge. Suddenly, the radio inside the police cruiser crackled to life. It was a loud, harsh burst of static that made everyone jump. The second officer, who was leaning against the sedan, opened the car door and leaned in to listen. Dispatch to 4 Alpha. Please respond regarding the subject you have detained. The second officer picked up the microphone. Sir, Alpha here. Go ahead. We have a hit on the name and credentials you provided. The dispatcher's voice came through, sounding distant and metallic. Please confirm the spelling of the last name. The officer looked over at the man on the curb, then back at his notes. Tat. He stopped. He looked at the driver's license he had taken from the man's wallet. He read the spelling carefully into the radio. There was a long pause on the other end. It lasted so long that the officer tapped the microphone. Dispatch. Did you copy? When the voice came back, it wasn't the usual casual tone. It was serious, clipped, and hurried. 4 Alpha, stand by. We are transferring this call to the Bureau Field Office. Please hold. The two officers looked at each other. The color drained slightly from the face of the taller one. He stopped pacing. He stood still, his hand going to his belt, but this time he wasn't touching his gun. He was scratching his hip, a nervous twitch. The Bureau? The second officer asked, his voice wavering just a little bit. Why are they getting involved? Probably to tell us these are really good fakes, the taller officer said, trying to sound tough. But his voice lacked the bite it had earlier. The man on the curb didn't smile. He didn't say, I told you so. He just sat there, his heart rate finally beginning to slow down. The worst part, the physical danger, the shouting, the guns, was likely over. Now came the hard part, the cleanup. A few seconds later, a new voice came over the radio. This voice was deep, authoritative, and sounded incredibly stressed. This is Special Agent in Charge Daniels, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I am speaking to the officers on scene with Agent Thorne. The taller officer picked up the microphone. He hesitated for a split second before pressing the button. This is Officer. This is the patrol unit. We have a male subject here claiming to be an agent. He is not a subject. The voice boomed over the speaker, so loud they could hear it standing outside the car. He is a supervisory special agent. You have unlawfully detained a federal officer. You have confiscated his service weapon. You are currently interfering with an active operation. Now, you listen to me very carefully. You are going to uncuff him immediately. You are going to return his weapon and his credentials, and you are going to treat him with the respect his rank demands. Do I make myself clear? The taller officer's mouth opened slightly. He looked like a fish out of water. He looked at the man on the curb, really looked at him for the first time, maybe seeing the truth in his eyes that had been there all along. We didn't know. The badge looked. I don't care what it looked like. The voice on the radio shouted, He gave you his ID. You failed to do your job? Now, release him. I have agents rolling code 3 to your location. They will be there in under 3 minutes. If he is not standing up and free by the time they arrive, I will have your jobs and your badges. Do you understand me? The officer swallowed hard. His throat clicked. Yes, sir. Yes, understood. The radio went dead with a sharp click. The silence that followed was the heaviest thing the man had ever felt. It wasn't the tense silence of before. It was the suffocating silence of humiliation. The taller officer walked over to the curb. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked like a scolded child who had just broken a window and was trying to figure out how to fix it before his dad got home. He knelt down behind the man. I'm going to cut the ties now, the officer mumbled. His hands were shaken a little as he fumbled for his knife. The plastic zip tie snapped apart. The feeling was instant. Blood rushed back into the man's hands, sending a sharp pins and needles sensation through his wrists. He slowly brought his arms around to the front, rubbing his skin gently. He winced. It was red and raw, branded by the tight plastic. He stood up slowly. He was stiff, his knees popping as he straightened his legs. He turned to face the officers. They were standing there, shoulders slumped, avoiding eye contact. The aggression was gone, evaporated by a few words spoken over a radio. Now, they just looked small. "Officer," the man said. His voice was quiet, but it carried more weight than any shout. "My weapon?" The second officer quickly walked over to the hood of the car where he had placed the gun and the badge. He picked them up with both hands, holding them out like an offering. Here you go, sir. We were just doing our job, you know? We didn't mean anything by it." The man took his gun first. He checked the chamber empty, as it should be. He reloaded the magazine with practiced, smooth movements, the metallic click sounding crisp in the afternoon air. Then he took his badge. He looked at the leather wallet. It was scratched now. There was a smudge of dirt on the gold shield. He wiped it off with his thumb, almost gently, before clipping it back onto his belt. "Doing your job involves verifying facts," the man said, holstering his weapon. "It involves de-escalation. It involves listening. You didn't do any of that today. You saw a skin color in a car, and you made a decision. That decision was a mistake." Just then, a siren began to wail in the distance. It was far away, but it was getting closer fast. It wasn't the sad, slow wail of an ambulance. It was the hype-etched, aggressive yelp of a police interceptor. But the man knew it wasn't local police. It was his backup. The taller officer shifted his weight from foot to foot. He looked terrified of the siren. "Look, can we just forget about this? We can just say it was a misunderstanding. We'll tear up the ticket. We won't report it." The man looked at him. He really looked at him. He saw the fear, the desperation to save his own career. He saw a man who wasn't inherently evil, but who had let bias and laziness guide his actions. The man felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He didn't want to ruin these men's lives. He didn't want to be the reason they lost their pensions. But he also knew that if he let this slide, they would do it again. Maybe next time the person in the car wouldn't be an FBI agent. Maybe next time it would just be a regular guy, a teacher, a father, someone who didn't have a radio voice to save him. "I'm not going to forget it," the man said simply. "But I'm not going to let my colleagues arrest you on the spot, which is within my power to request. You will answer for what you did, but through the proper channels." The siren was very close now. The sound was bouncing off the houses. A black SUV with tinted windows screeched around the corner at the far end of the street, speeding toward them. The two local officers stepped back. They took off their hats. They looked down at their shoes. They knew their world was about to change. The SUV skidded to a halt half a block away, and 4 men in tactical vests jumped out, rifles in hand. They didn't look relaxed. They looked like they were ready to go to war. The man on the curb straightened his tie. He buttoned his jacket. He took a deep breath of the hot air. The humiliation on the curb was over. The paperwork, the investigations, the media fallout that was just beginning. But for now, he just watched his team run toward him. And for the first time in an hour, he finally felt safe. The black SUV hadn't even fully stopped before the doors flew open. 4 men in vests stepped out, moving with the kind of precision that you only see in movies or high-stakes raids. They didn't walk. They marched. Their eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, but their body language screamed aggression. They held their rifles low, ready to be raised in a second. To the 2 local officers standing by the curb, it must have looked like an army was invading their quiet street. The man on the curb didn't move. He just watched them come. He recognized the lead agent immediately. It was his direct supervisor, a man known for being calm under pressure, but absolutely terrifying when things went wrong. As the team got closer, they saw the man in the suit and relaxed their stances slightly. They lowered their weapons, realizing the target was their own colleague. But the look in their eyes shifted from tactical focus to a mix of horror and confusion. The supervisor walked right past the two local officers without even glancing at them. He stopped in front of the man and reached out, gripping his shoulder firmly. "Are you hurt?" the supervisor asked, his voice low and urgent. "Did they strike you?" The man shook his head slowly. "I'm okay. Just some scrapes and bruises. My wrists are cut up from the ties, but I'm all right." Supervisor nodded, his jaw tightening. He turned around slowly to face the two local officers. The change in the air was instant. The confident, arrogant officers from 10 minutes ago were gone. In their place stood two men who looked like they wanted the ground to open up and swallow them whole. They were pale, fidgeting with their uniform belts, avoiding eye contact with the federal agents who now surrounded them. "Which one of you put the cuffs on him?" the supervisor asked. It wasn't a shout. It was quieter than a shout, which made it much scarier. The taller officer stepped forward, just an inch. He looked like he was walking to the gallows. I did, sir. It was a standard procedure." "We thought you didn't think," the supervisor cut him off. "You saw a black man in a car, and you assumed he was a criminal. You had a federal agent face down in the dirt. Do you have any idea what could have happened here? Do you have any idea what kind of diplomatic mess you've created?" The younger officer spoke up, his voice shaking badly. "We told him to stop. He didn't stop, and he said he had a gun. We were just being safe." "You were being reckless," the supervisor snapped. This man identified himself. He had credentials. You chose to ignore them because they didn't fit the story you had in your head. The man in the suit finally stepped between his boss and the local officers. He didn't want a shouting match in the middle of the street. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted to go home. "It's done," the man said, placing a hand on his supervisor's arm to calm him down. "Let's not make a scene. The neighbors are watching." He looked down the street. Sure enough, curtains were twitching. People were standing on their porches, trying to see what the fuss was about. He knew that by tomorrow, everyone in the neighborhood would have a version of this story. Some would say he was a drug dealer. Others would say he was a victim. He just wanted to control the narrative as much as he could now. He turned back to the local officers. "I want my registration and my license back. And I want the ticket you were writing torn up." The taller officer scrambled back to the cruiser. He grabbed the clipboard, almost dropping it in his haste. He ripped the paper in half, then in half again, and shoved the pieces into his pocket. He returned with the man's wallet and paperwork. He held them out with both hands, his head bowed. I am truly sorry," the officer stammered. "I really am. I was just trying to do my job. I didn't know." The man took his wallet. He looked at the officer's face. There was sweat on his forehead, and his eyes were wide with fear. The man realized that this was the first time the officer had probably ever faced real consequences for his actions on the job. He was used to being the one with the power. Now, the power was gone, and he was terrified. "You need to do better," the man said quietly. "You can't keep treating people like this just because of how they look. One day you're going to pull over the wrong person, or you're going to hurt someone who doesn't have a badge to protect them. And then, sorry won't be enough." The officer just nodded. He couldn't speak. The man turned to his team. "Let's go. I need to file a report, and I need a shower." He walked toward his car. The local officers stood there, frozen, watching him go. They didn't get back into their cruiser. They didn't resume their patrol. They just stood on the side of the road like statues, watching the federal agents get back into their SUV and the man slide into the driver's seat of his sedan. Before he got in, he looked at his reflection in the car window. His suit was dusty. There was a tear in the jacket near the shoulder. His face was smudged with dirt. He didn't look like a high-ranking federal agent anymore. He looked like a man who had been through a fight, and he felt like it too. The drive back to the field office was quiet. The supervisor followed behind him in the SUV, lights flashing now, clearing a path through the city traffic. It felt strange to be driving with an escort, to have traffic moving out of his way. He felt exposed. Every time he stopped at a light, he wondered if people in the cars next to him could see the red marks on his wrists. He wondered if they knew. When they arrived at the modern, glass front building that housed the Bureau's offices, the adrenaline finally started to wear off. It was replaced by a deep, aching exhaustion. He parked his car in the secured garage and walked into the building. The receptionist greeted him with a smile, which froze on her face when she saw his condition. She stood up, alarmed. "Agent, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a rough day at the office." He walked to the locker room, the heavy rubber soles of his shoes squeaking on the polished floor. He went to his locker and opened it. He looked at himself in the mirror for a long time. He touched his face, feeling the grit. He thought about the knee in his back. He thought about the laugh in the officer's voice when he held up the badge. It wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. It was the disrespect. The stripping away of his humanity. He took off his jacket. He undid his tie. He washed his face in the sink, the cold water shocking his skin. He scrubbed hard, trying to wash away the feeling of the pavement, but it didn't work. It was under his skin now. He knew that tomorrow the paperwork would land on his desk. The local police department would launch an internal investigation. There would be lawyers, depositions, and meetings. The media would probably pick up the story: FBI agent arrested by local police. It would be a scandal. But he knew he wouldn't let it disappear. He couldn't. If he stayed silent, he was part of the problem. He had to use this moment to make sure it didn't happen to anyone else. He dried his face with a rough paper towel. He took a deep breath. He put his badge back on his belt, right where it belonged. It clicked into place. He looked at himself in the mirror one last time. He was tired, but he was still standing. He was still an agent. He walked out of the locker room, his back straight, his head high. He walked into the supervisor's office to start the report. The door closed behind him, and the work began. The shouting in the street was over, but the fight for justice was just starting. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork and hushed conversations in sterile hallways. The incident on the roadside didn't just vanish into the air. It turned into a heavy, tangible file that landed on the desk of the internal affairs captain at the local police department. For the man in the suit, life had to go on. He still had cases to solve, reports to file, and bad guys to chase. But the weight of what happened sat on his shoulders like a backpack full of stones. He was sitting at his desk a week later. When the official report landed in his email inbox, it was a dense document, full of legal jargon and bureaucratic language, but the conclusion at the bottom was simple and clear. The two officers had been suspended with pay, pending a full federal investigation into their conduct. The department had issued a public apology, but it was one of those carefully written statements that didn't really say we were wrong. It said we regret the misunderstanding. The man stared at the screen. A misunderstanding is when you order the wrong coffee. Being thrown to the ground, handcuffed, and humiliated for 10 minutes while your credentials sit on the hood of a car isn't a misunderstanding. It's a failure of judgment. He knew that the suspension was just the first step. The real battle was just beginning. He was called into a meeting of few. Days later with the local police chief, the chief's office was on the top floor of the city building, overlooking the very streets that his officers patrolled. It was a nice office with leather chairs and a view of the skyline. The chief stood up when the agent walked in, extending a hand and offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was the smile of a politician, not a cop. "Thank you for coming in," the chief said, gesturing for the agent to sit. "I wanted to do this in person. I want you to know that we take this very seriously." The agent sat down. He didn't bother with small talk. He was tired of the polite dances. "My wrists are still healing, Chief. My suit was ruined. And I have neighbors who now look at me like I'm a criminal because they saw me in handcuffs. Taking it seriously isn't enough." The chief nodded, his face solemn. He picked up a letter from his desk. "I know. We have started disciplinary proceedings against both officers. They are facing a tribunal. But I also wanted to ask if there is anything we can do to resolve this without dragging the department through the mud. We are willing to offer a settlement. Compensation for your suit for the emotional distress. We want to make this right." The agent looked at the letter, then back at the chief. He realized then that the chief wasn't sorry about what happened to him. He was sorry about the lawsuit. He was sorry about the bad press. He was trying to buy silence. I don't want your money, the agent said, his voice quiet but firm. I don't want a settlement that makes me sign a paper saying I won't talk about this. If I take that money, then you just sweep it under the rug. And those 2 officers? They go back on the street in 6 months and do it to someone else. Someone who doesn't have a badge. Someone who can't fight back. The chief leaned forward, looking worried. What are you asking for? I want them fired, the agent said. Or at the very least, stripped of their ability to patrol alone. I want them retrained, not just slapped on the wrist. And I want you to admit publicly that your officers used racial profiling. Call it what it is. The room went silent. The chief looked at the agent, really looked at him, and saw a man who wasn't going to be bought. He saw a man who had spent his life fighting for the truth and wasn't about to stop now. We will see what the tribunal decides, the chief said slowly. But I can't promise you they will be fired. There is a union contract. There are procedures. The agent stood up. Do your job, Chief. If you don't, the Department of Justice will. Walking out of the police station, the air felt different. It was lighter. He had spoken his truth, and he hadn't backed down. He got into his car and drove home. It was the evening, and the sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows across the pavement. When he pulled into his driveway, he saw his neighbor, an older man who was usually out watering his lawn at this time. The neighbor looked up, saw the agent, and hesitated. He probably heard the rumors. He probably saw the police cars last week. But instead of looking away, the neighbor gave a small, respectful nod and a wave. It wasn't a wave of pity. It was a wave of recognition. The agent nodded back. That small moment meant more than any letter from a police chief. A few weeks later, the local news station ran a story. It wasn't just about the arrest. It was about the fallout. The reporter stood in front of the police department, talking about new protocols being put in place. She mentioned that officers were going to be required to take extra training on de-escalation and implicit bias. She mentioned that 2 officers were under review for possible termination. The man sat on his couch watching it, his family sitting beside him. His daughter looked up at him. Is that about you, Dad? Yes, he said. It is. Did they really hurt you? She asked, her eyes wide with concern. He put his arm around her. They made a mistake, honey. A big one. But sometimes, when people make big mistakes, it gives us a chance to fix things so they don't happen again to anyone else. He knew the system wasn't perfect. The 2 officers might find jobs in another town. The bias that existed in the world wasn't going to disappear overnight. But today, in this city, the rules had changed a little bit. Because one man refused to stay quiet. Because one man demanded the dignity he had earned. The story ended, and the news switched to the weather. The man turned off the TV. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his quiet, safe street. The streetlights were flickering on. Kids were riding bikes home before dark. It was just a normal evening. And that was the point. He wanted everyone, no matter what they looked like or what car they drove, to be able to have a normal evening. He wanted everyone to have the chance to just drive home without fear. He adjusted his tie in the reflection of the glass, a habit he couldn't break. He wasn't looking for a parade. He wasn't looking for a medal. He just did his job. He protected the people, even if that meant protecting them from the very people sworn to serve them. He took a deep breath, feeling the tension finally leave his chest. The fight for today was done. And tomorrow, he would wake up, put on his badge, and do it all over again. Because that is what real life looks like. It's not about the ending being perfect. It's about making sure the next day is a little bit better than the last.